And the assumption that was made in Washington is, well, if the Germans are importing and 40% of their energy from Russia, that makes them dependent on Russia, and they could then become the slaves of Moscow. Well, that's absurd, because you also have to look at what the Germans are selling to the Russians. And you could make the argument that the Russians are slaves to German technology, engineering, and other capabilities. I think it was a terrible mistake to destroy that line. And I think the Germans will increasingly come to the conclusion that that was an act of war against Germany. And one can certainly argue it was an act of war against Russia. Now, we have never admitted to doing anything. And there is now a great deal of information on the net about the United Kingdom having ultimately been at the center of all of this. I am not in the government, in the administration, and I am not privileged to those, so I don't know what the answer is. But from my standpoint, if I were a German or a Russian, I would see this as a very hostile act, an act that is antithetical to my national security, my interests, my strategic position. Now, interestingly enough, it appears that the Norwegians are now delivering natural gas to Poland. And the Poles are paying more for Norwegian natural gas than they did for Russian natural gas, which I guess is interesting for the Poles, but they'd much rather pay more and get it from Norway than Russia, I'm sure. I don't know what's going on, but it doesn't look good to me. And my concern from the beginning was NATO would probably not survive this if it lasted for more than 6 months. In fact, the EU may not survive it. There are too many divergent interests, but most important, the thing that we seem to be most interested in Washington is driving a wedge between Germany and Russia. And in doing the things that we have thus far, I think we will achieve the opposite outcome. That before the year is out, we will see a very different relationship emerge between Moscow and Berlin that we probably are not going to like. Well, you know, Norway is one of those countries that if you ask about it in the United States, you will hear people say, oh, I love Norway. Norway is wonderful. Norwegians are wonderful. Everyone feels that way. So Norway enjoys a very positive position with Americans. The issue for Norway is, what is the strategic benefit to Norway of cultivating hostility with Russia? When I ask that question, I see no benefit to Norway from a bad strategic relationship with Russia. Now, obviously, the Norwegians have an alliance with the United States. We call it NATO, but on a bilateral level, it's very real. It's there. Also with the United Kingdom. But what do we know from history? We know that in 1940, Norway was neutral. Churchill discarded that out of hand, dismissed it out of hand, and said, no, we must race to Norway and beat the Germans to it. If we don't take on Norway, then Norway will end up being occupied by the Germans. And he was joined in this by the president of France. Remember, they put together a force that was supposed to originally march across Norway and Sweden to join the Finns in fighting the Russians, which would then have made Great Britain and France the enemies of both Russia or the Soviet Union and Germany at the same time. That didn't work out. And so the fallback position was, well, let's go to Norway. I don't think Norway benefited very much from the whole experience. And I don't think that we or the British right now can invest enough if Norway needed it to rescue Norway.